So, do you understand what joint liability actually means if you're married in community or property? Do you know what that entails? Well, let's talk about this. And the reason why I want us to talk about it is simply because a lot of people tend to not really understand what this actually means. And they find out at the most difficult times, either when they have lost their spouse, or alternatively, when a creditor is now coming or gunning for them, and then they get the shock of their lives that they're actually now liable for something that they never knew they were liable for. So I don't want us to waste time. Let's get to the discussion. Well, afternoon. For all those that are new here, welcome. Please do join us next time again because we do talk about things that are valuable to you. But by introduction, my name is Yolanda Mnyangeza and I'm an attorney and a director at Mnyangeza Attorneys. Let's get to the conversation. So, do you understand what it means to have joint liability by virtue of the fact that you are married in community of property? Well, let's explain this for a second. In terms of South African law, when you enter into a marriage in community of property, what happens is that everything that you had and your spouse had is joined together, and then you both create what we call a joint estate. And both of you are equally liable for every debt that each of you bring to this marriage because now you are joint owners of a joint estate, right? So it doesn't matter whether the debts were equal or unequal, now they are joined, and both of you are jointly liable for those debts because you've created a joint estate. A lot of people tend to believe that going forward, because they are now part of a joint estate, they can never be liable for another spouse's debts unless, of course, they give them permission. Is that the case? Well, that's not necessarily the case. A spouse is allowed, in terms of the law, to enter into a debt on their own without necessarily getting permission from you or consent from you as the other spouse. However, there are limitations to this, where a spouse will be required to actually seek your consent as the other spouse, and this consent must be written. What are those circumstances? Let's talk about one where your spouse wants to bind themselves as surety, right, for another person's debt. They will need your permission because should something happen and they now are being pursued as the surety, you will also be in trouble or the joint estate will be compromised. So you have to then give them consent in terms of the law. But be that as it may, there are circumstances where this spouse of yours, even when they have signed as surety without your permission, you can still be liable. What are those circumstances? Well, where a person, for instance, let's say your spouse is conducting a business and they take out debts for that business, right? Whatever it is that they're doing is for the ordinary course of their business. So you're not necessarily involved in that. So it does happen that during the course of running that business, your spouse decides they're going to stand a surety for those debts. Even though generally you meant to give them, this consent because they're going to act as surety, because now they are taking out a debt in the course of their ordinary business and they're binding themselves as surety in that regard, it's not necessarily going to be required for you to grant them the consent. Meaning what? Meaning that they can enter into a contract where they're binding them as surety. And if something happens, the company can't pay for that debt and they are being pursued, it will mean that the joint estate is going to be at jeopardy, and you as the other spouse will also be in a position where you may need to cough up money to help cover for that debt, because now the joint estate is being pursued. So, and then the other way in which you become or you are jointly liable here for the debts of your spouse also is when your spouse takes out debts without you. Like I said, in terms of the law, a spouse is not necessarily required to get your permission for all debts that they're going to take out. It's only for specific debts where they will be required to get your consent. So it means that then the spouse can take out, things such as loans without you being present. Does that mean that you can never be held liable for those loans that that spouse takes? Well, it's unfortunate that you're going to be liable because going forward, because you're part of this joint estate, if they take out debt and you also take out debt, both of you are jointly liable for all those types of debts. So, what that means is that if they cannot pay for that debt for whatever reason, the joint estate is also at risk, and you also can end up being jointly liable and being sued to pay for those debts. So it means then that you cannot run away from the fact that you're going to be jointly liable for the debts that your spouse takes out. Now, some of the things that people often ask is, but what should the case be if I did not even spend that money? I didn't see it. Well, what the law says is that it's not going to change anything. You will still be jointly liable, but you will have a recourse at the dissolution of the marriage, right? Where you can show that you never spent any of this money, they benefited, and yet you ended up paying for that particular debt. So you can then make that argument during that particular time. Otherwise, as for now, you being in this joint estate means you are going to be liable for your spouse's debts, right? So this is something that's important for you guys to know so that you don't get surprises when you get sued. A lot of people often hear this when they get summons served at their household. Then they get the shock of their lives that, okay, now I'm also being sued for something that I know nothing about. So you need to understand this so that you're always prepared. And secondly, if you're someone who has not yet entered into a marriage, so that you can really assess the kind of marriage that will be suitable for you. So let's talk about the last thing which you're going to be jointly liable for as a spouse. Again, when it comes to debts, some people find out at the death of their spouse that they're going to be jointly liable for those debts that the spouse actually took out. For example, like I said, the spouse which you're married to is not going to be restricted from taking out debt. Unfortunately, it's only when it comes to certain contracts where they will be restricted. So which means they will take out debt, as much as they like, and you at times will not be aware of that. And irrespective of you not knowing, you will still be liable. And this may also affect you when they pass away. Now remember, when a spouse passes away, that's a dissolution of a marriage. So it will mean that those people owed by the joint estate have to be settled. So you can expect to hear or see creditors coming to knock to say, I want my money paid, and this debt was made by your husband. And you will end up being liable for those debts. So if you don't have money, what will this mean? What will this look like during that time? So if there's no money in the joint estate to settle those debts, you can rest assured whatever property that is in that joint estate will have to be sold to settle those debts. So that is how you're going to be affected. If the only thing you're left with, unfortunately, here is a property which you are living at, it will get to a situation where that property will be sold in order for that debt to be covered. Or alternatively, you will have to run around to try and find money to settle those creditors. That is what joint liability in a marriage in community of property entails. It means that you will suffer consequences of the actions of your spouse, whether you were there or not, whether you also benefited from the amount or not, whether you did or did not give them permission in instances where they did not need your permission. You will be jointly liable for that. So, that in a nutshell is what a joint liability of a marriage in community or property entails. So, I hope that was helpful to you. So, if it was, do not hesitate to actually share it to other folks so that they can also benefit from this discussion. Also, come back as we have more discussions about these types of things, right? Just note, never take this information as legal advice, but rather for educational purposes. You may still want to see your own legal practitioner for whatever matter that you have, right? But be that as it may, we hope this information was helpful. Well, we'll see you next time when we talk about something else that could be useful to you. Again, my name is Yolanda Mnyengeza and I'm an attorney and a director at Mnyengeza Attorneys. We'll see you next time.